Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And is this the week where I finally get close to being back on schedule? Certainly feels like it. And we've got quite the motley assortment here, so let's get on the pulse. So before we go any further, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. But we have 6 projects on the docket. Let's start off with, from second in command, Cupidity.
I don't mean to boast, actually that's a lie. You're stuck in the same trance. You're starting a pity party, I'ma catch your body, fuck a rain dance. I'm never gonna face plant.
Alright, I've covered second in command a decent bit over the past couple of years, and going into this project, they were hoping to adapt a lot of the tones and hazy auto-tune cloud trap that normally default to flexing for something with a different brand of introspection, with more guest collaborators and arguably their most refined production and set of beats to date. And yeah, going right from the top, I'm not sure that approach always helps them, especially in comparison with some guests who have a cleaner and sharper vocal pickup, and thus will come across as a little bit more immediate than how much second will drench their voice in auto-tune and sound a little bit more insulated and muted within the mix. Now, some of that is intentional, given the arc of the album. We'll get to it. And I take issue with this on mainstream rap albums where you can tell that the verses were obviously recorded in different studios, but until the production can pick up the layers in order to flatter their subtler moods of expression or place second more prominently in the mix to at least match some of the guests, a more defined vocal presence from them probably would help, either through double tracking the verses or just projecting a little bit more on the record. Now granted, it's also not precisely consistent track over track, half because second is really trying to balance out their spitter instincts with their more melodic trap side, but also because the production palette is a lot more varied and scattered. There's a lot more of the watery, emo trap guitar grooves, but then you get a sugary blast of mid-2000s chiptune synth on Magic, or the horns and the very watery textured percussion on Golden, or the sparse, haunted banger of Faceplant, that with the looped siren, I actually really like that song. But then we get to the album's arc and a lot of the content, which finds the loose story of trying to find some minor success, having it all go to their head, and then in the dogged trace for a real breakthrough that doesn't seem to be coming, and the burning through of a potential relationship along the way, there is a sharp lapse into much darker territory, depression that leads to a really bleak ending. And now I won't spoil it beyond saying that there's an explicit parallel to that last Jetty Bones album, but I'm not really sure it feels earned, specifically because on Pushback, the extremely dark ending comes off of a whirling flight of pop emotion, where all the depression leaks between the cracks until the emotional levee breaks, which helps Jetty Bones be a little bit more likable and sympathetic. Now with second, the key word framing the majority of this album is desperation, for acceptance, for fame, for the very real fear of hitting a brick wall with their artistic progression, and thus they drive people away. It can come across a little bit more self-serving, might be more relatable to a certain target audience, but likely a lot less likable, which makes the end of the project, again, really bleak by the end. Not a bad thing, per se. An album this reminded me of immediately was B. Dolan's The Failure, especially in how raw and ramshackle it can be. And on that note, I'd probably call this their more thematically cohesive and well-executed project to date. But the next step really does come with building more layers, more details, more refinement into it. This is a pretty lean album running around a half hour, and I gotta say it, in contrast to previous projects, there was space for a little bit more to flesh out the story, which might help some of the stylistic diversions not feel like one-offs. That being said, the melodic hooks are better, the rapping is tight as ever, although it's Daniel in the Lion's Den, not David, and you can tell there was more time been put into the production and the writing across the board. For this brand of melodic trap, I think if you can get into your head what this is trying to do on the bass level and past some of the rougher presentation, this'll be a welcome surprise. So, strong 6 out of 10? Definitely worth a mention. Give it a chance. Next up from Zack Fox, Shut the Fuck Up Talking to Me.
In the mirror trying to check my appearance, getting head while I'm staring, singing Marvin lyrics. You with your dusty ass bitch running errands.
This is an odd one for me, because I generally stay away from material that's explicitly framed as comedy rap, and not as just casually funny like Bruiser Wolf was. But I've seen enough of Zack Fox's online presence, and I was aware of his collaborative work with Kenny Beats, which led to the 2019 viral breakthrough through of Jesus Is the One, I Got Depression, and so I did want to give this a chance, and besides, the project clocked under 20 minutes. It should be very easy to talk about. And it is, mostly because projects like this are the reason I don't normally talk about comedy rap, because this is really underwhelming, all things considered. First off, even though it is just under 20 minutes, it exposes just how limited Zack Fox's comedy rap can really go. He's got one flat, confrontational vocal tone, very limited flows, defaults to a lot of basic comparisons, and the punchlines normally hit the same disaffected, I'm doing something wild, or like something wild, and not only does it just become kind of repetitive, it's only periodically funny with a couple nuggets of wit, especially when the whole going over the top quasi-ironically method of comedy in hip-hop is so overdone these days, especially in contrast with the quasi-mundane or quasi-nerdy references. Like, Bruiser Wolf may have issues structuring punchlines into more coherent hooks, but they were more creative and delivered with a lot more flair and dimensionality. This often feels rigid to a fault with a lot of low-rent 2 Chainz bars, and I put some of that down to the pretty basic production that's not even consistently mixed or mastered. So while there might be more hooks to make the bangers go off, Zack Fox has such a limited delivery that he can't really make the most of it. And yes, I include the quasi-auto-tune freakouts that he occasionally catches on. Yeah, the Alchemist groove on the closing title track, really damn smooth, probably the best song here. But at the end of the day, humor is so subjective, and this feels more like it was built for short snippets that lead to a chuckle on Twitter or TikTok, and little else. Extremely light 5 out of 10. Frankly, I'm being generous. Next up from Ice 9 Kills, The Silver Scream 2. Welcome to Horrorwood.
But the devil makes exceptions. We're all American psychos.
So I've been one to join a chorus of complaints that modern mainstream metalcore has been stale for years, but identifying precisely why is a tougher conversation. Now, you can argue that the whole trashcore movement or the infusion of gent riffs, they were the major contributing factors, but from a casual observer's point of view, it seemed like a lot of acts really struggled to differentiate themselves from the pack, both in content and the sound. It just kind of ran together. So Ice 9 Kills did get some of my attention for embracing a schlocky horror movie homage gimmick midway into the 2010s, where of course it started to get really campy, but if there's a genre that can actually use some levity and an actual sense of fun, it is modern metalcore. And going through their catalog, you know, I definitely think they hit a more distinctive stride in 2018's The Silver Scream on sheer novelty, embracing some of that pop-punk theatricality that's very 2000s, and a lot of over-the-top silliness. I mean, they're not matching clipping when it comes to a more thorough deconstruction of horror iconography, but they're also not really trying to go that deep, and instead embracing the surface spook house vibe, and that should work just fine. I did wonder how on earth they would pull together a sequel, given how the concept was already kind of running thin on the first project, and funnily enough, that was the exact same concern I had for clipping back in 2020. But now having heard the album, well, I gotta say I'm a bit conflicted on it, but it's really more applicable to Ice 9 Kills in recent years as a whole, because outside of a very thin allusion to the frontman being a serial killer that gets dropped after the title track, it's the same gimmick across this album as The Silver Scream, with one song per franchise that is often embarrassingly on the nose, calling out exactly what it references. Now, for one, it's absolutely not scary, in the same way that your average Halloween party isn't scary, so I'm not docking them points for it, but it does strike me as a missed opportunity to showcase any subtlety or dynamics that this band also doesn't really have. Instead, you get a lot of over-the-top theatrical metalcore with some pretty damn solid melodic hooks and some really nice shredding solos, but it's short on killer grooves where, like the first album, how much you might enjoy a song often comes down to how much you will enjoy the film or franchise that's being referenced. Now, on the one hand, Hip to Be Scared, it's a riff on American Psycho that translates the iconic music monologue to be about Ice 9 Kills, and I am absolutely self-aware enough about even just this review to laugh uproariously about it. What an amazing moment. Best song on the album. But on the other hand, Worst Vacation is about Hostel and falls completely flat, and Assault and Batteries is about the Child's Play franchise, and I enjoyed that song about as much as I would be enjoying Locked in a Room with John Gruden. Now granted, A lot of this is not helped by my general ambivalence towards metalcore. I'll say this again, it's not my genre, and the kick drum triggers and the underweight low end don't help this nearly be as crushing as it's trying to be, especially compared with more extreme metal. But this is also where the general sense of screwball kookiness feels like Ice Nine Kills are precisely aware of how camp this is. And with a mostly uniform sense of tone, you lose the opportunity to do a little bit more distinctive things with their franchises that they're running through beyond just referencing them, which can make some of the songs and franchises hit too much of the same beat. And hell, by the time they get to Ex-Mørtis spoofing Evil Dead, which became a parody of itself by the very end in Army of Darkness, it kind of becomes hard to take any of this all that seriously. Even if I will say the groove on that song is really fun. But that's the thing, if you can get into the right headspace, this is a lot of fun, and I can imagine the live show just kills. And yeah, the pun's intended, but that's also the spirit of the band. They've already used that pun for a live album last year. But if you're not a metalcore fan, hi, it also comes across as a more extravagant sequel that hits a lot of the same beats, and I'm just not sure it rises to excellence, at least for me. So, 7 out of 10, worth a listen, very niche, just keep that in mind. Next up from the Zac Brown Band, The Comeback.
Same stars, we all hope and hope floats. We're all in the same boat.
Well, at least the band seems to be mildly self-aware about it. But truth be told, I've always thought Zac Brown was aware of what he was doing when he put out The Owl with the band and then the Controversy solo, and then promptly drove his reputation into the earth's core because both those albums were shocking disappointments. Because they were terrible. And it wasn't just me who said that. Even the fans hated a lot of those projects, and by this band's standard, they tanked commercially. So maybe take a break, get away from touring, retool, get a new project together. That was probably a really smart idea. Even if the last time they made a Return to Roots project on Welcome Home, it wound up really underwhelming. Now, digging a little bit deeper, it also looks like there was a bunch of label shakeups and Zac Brown getting a divorce in the past 5 years that probably exacerbated some of the problems there, but now it looks like things are a little bit more stable. They're back under their own label in Warner Music Nashville, which given their old label is Atlantic, that was owned by Warner, might wind up a return to roots more than many will realize. But is this an album that can actually earn that title, earn that name? Well, yes. It actually does. And thank God for it. Look, I'm not sure this is guaranteed to yank the Zac Brown Band back to popularity they had in the early 2010s, but it's probably the closest and most focused thing that they have delivered calling back to that territory in years, which is very refreshing, especially again, as their last attempt with Welcome Home felt like it was trying to pander to an indie country audience that wasn't really all that fun or interesting with the actual music we got. This is a lot more rambunctious, lightweight. It's Zac Brown Band knowing who they are again. A little bit of genre blending and how we'll dabble in Caribbean textures or Southern rock with G.A. Clay, or touches with soul and gospel, but still going back to the loose, Southern fried jam band vibe that's always been this group's strong suit. Now, I can't always say it matches those earliest projects, especially not Uncaged. Zac Brown's voice doesn't quite have the easy warmth and natural charm that came so easily before, and his current set of co-producers can't quite capture the fantastic blending and mix balance that Keith Stegall brought. So the grooves will feel a little clunkier and a little bit more rickety due to less bass presence and some heavier percussion. And for an album that runs for 15 songs and occasionally long in spots, it's hard to ignore, especially as some of those patches can drag. Now, thankfully, Zac Brown's gotten away from the clumsy electronic embellishments, and maybe the closest to this territory becomes the strings-backed Any Day Now, particularly in the beginning, but it's also the post-divorce song that stands as one of the album highlights with a terrific hook, alongside the remarkably stirring Come Together title track that might be one of the few post-pandemic songs I actually might consider backing. Seriously, it's that anthemic. It kicks ass in surprising ways. Hell, honestly, the single Same Boat, it's in that same territory, and yet strikes me as one of the clunkier songs on the album, along with the closer, Don't Let Your Heart, which is about getting away from your phone, going outside to relax. It's not that far behind. But even if this album is just taking the Zac Brown Band back to their relaxed comfort zone with a few legit terrific highlights, I will give them credit for sticking the landing. And yeah, solid 7 out of 10. It's not a train record. Nice to have these guys back on the right track. Next up, from PinkPantheress, To Hell With It.
I'm not acting the way I think you'd like. We went for dinner, and now you're acting paranoid. If only you knew the way I felt inside.
So this is one of those cases where I've heard far more about this act in passing as what the kids are into, rather than actually having chart traction, at least in the States. Funnily enough, once she got signed to a major label off the back of her TikTok, she wound up getting a decent number of charting hits on the UK charts, but I also saw a lot of folks reflecting in advance that I obviously wouldn't like this, which I found a little bit odd, and thus I wanted to go into this with an open mind. And now, having heard this mixtape more than a couple of times, even if I know it's not targeted at me, I do get the appeal. A lot of very cleanly produced, but still slightly ragged, fluttery samples backing PinkPantheress' very sweet vocals, with a lot of quicker percussion that owes a decent bit to the poppiest sides of garage and breakbeat, where it flows so quickly that it can become kind of difficult for any one scene to fully materialize. And that's also kind of the point. It has the feel of a bored teenager scrolling through Tumblr or TikTok, where you capture the experience in more of a fractured blur, only reinforced by how PinkPantheress is also a bit of an unreliable narrator, where she admits very early on that she lies frequently, and where unpeeling the half-formed collage of diary entries did pull me in more than I thought it would, mostly because you can tell that at least some of those lies she's telling to herself. That being said, given the songs are so short, you'd think there'd be more nuggets within individual tracks that would hit harder, showcase a little bit more detail, flesh out more of the stories, or have more of these fluttery pieces add up to more in aggregate, especially as very few of these pieces could really stand on their own. And this is where I think PinkPantheress does stumble a little bit. She's not really an expressive singer, and it contributes to this odd sort of detached numbness that, yes, on some level is intentional, but also can feel very guarded, borderline capricious at points, given all the flighty relationship melodrama that overruns the album. Now, my favorite moment on this project probably comes with 19, where after she comes back to her hometown after a year at university, against some of the mournful strings, she's actually forced to confront a world that has moved on without her back home. And it crystallizes some of that pervasive loneliness that's an undercurrent to this entire project, and also forces her away from getting stuck in her own head. Unfortunately, since the sequencing on this album is just not that good to build up to any specific moments, it's not the closing track, and we're back to the standard melodrama to end things off. But as a whole, this is harmless. It's honestly pretty good, and despite only coming in fleeting pieces, PinkPantheress has a more distinctive identity and groove to her work than I really expected. Now, that being said, I appreciate she's calling this more of a mixtape, not really a full debut album, because it does feel a little more like a fleeting curiosity, and it does need a bit more development, but I do think it's a good curiosity, and I did enjoy this. Light 7 out of 10? Again, I enjoyed it more than I thought I would, likely more than you think I would too. And hell, maybe more than you think you would. Check it out. And finally, from Young Thug, Punk.
All I see is a bunch of ops trying to rise from the dead, wanna smoke me like I'm indoors. All I see is a bunch of broke ass bitches trying to tell me I ain't poppin', I ain't hot no more.
You know, despite seemingly covering him every other week on Billboard Breakdown and going through multiple album bombs, I've never formally reviewed a Young Thug project. And, well, okay, I'm not going to say it was a conscious effort to avoid him, because, again, Billboard Breakdown made him inescapable, but I also didn't really feel the need to cover his bloated albums and mixtapes that could make for some splashy and very colorful trap that I absolutely would not have appreciated 5 years ago during his most distinctive critical peak with Jeffrey, which is probably his best. But he could also feel a little one-note in the over-the-top content, rarely accentuating a more interesting and colorful MC behind the microphone, especially given just how much material he has saturated the market with, which kind of works against him, because you can point to his best and a lot of it's not that. But now he's putting out albums proper, with So Much Fun back in 2019, and now this. Well, I don't want to say it's a bait and switch given how this album starts, but I would not be surprised if some folks think that given how it seems like Young Thug tries to place his focus in slightly more conscious terms, it's just not done all that well. Very telling given how he frames all the women as responsible for causing divides on the opening track, and then as a hectoring frustration on stupid asking. And it's just utterly bizarre that J. Cole is the one who goes for the flex verse and Future doesn't. But you know what, trying to drill into angst from the streets and failed relationships against a lot of watery guitars and keys backing up the trap knock, it certainly feels like territory that Young Thug would touch if he wanted to make more serious content. But not only is this becoming a very overused sound, even for the rappers in trap who work in this territory, territory, your Polo G, your Lil Durk. It's hard not to feel like Thugger sounds so disconnected in his delivery and his passing bars that are trying to focus on this territory, not helped by how quick he will slip back towards the flexing, where at this point even he sounds bored with it. And yet, even with that, about a third of the way through, around the time we get the Juice WRLD verse with Kanye and Pierre producing a swamped out mess, we're back to standard Young Thug on autopilot, except with production that's already sounding dated. But alright, fine, we're now going for the decent hooks and memorable bangers, the lower standards we traveled with before. What's worth mentioning here? Well, I'm fairly certain that hook from Post Malone and the snap beat on Livin' It Up with A$AP Rocky, it's barely a step away from a weak pop country campfire song, but at least I will remember it. And I might throw in the poorly tuned piano behind Fifth Day Dead that had a pretty good hook, and maybe the punchier groove of Hate the Game as well. And that's a lot more than I can say about the rest of this bloated, stream-trolling clunker of an album, where the production swivels wildly from Polo G knockoffs to poorly mixed bass abuse that includes one of the Drake's laziest verses in recent memory, and I've heard Certified Lover Boy, Doja Cat pitching everything into some excruciating tones on Icy Hot, a painfully undercooked Chance the Rapper-esque ballad with Nate Ruess on the hook, and to end off the album, a cut with the late Mac Miller where I really struggled to find any pathos in it. Folks, you know what? I might have warmed to Young Thug's sound in recent years, but this album is short on hooks, good production, fresh content, Young Thug giving a shit, and this was the worry I had once he stopped experimenting more in the mid-2010s. The projects would get very samey and boring and default to the lowest common denominator. I mean, it's not punk in the slightest, and I wouldn't even say it was so much fun. Light 4 out of 10. At least Young Thug has a vocal personality, unlike his proteges like Lil Keed and Gunna, but that's not saying much, and this wasn't good. Hate to say it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Look, I tried to get into Young Thug by the end. I know this is probably the worst possible album to review solo coming up with him, but again, just didn't do much for me. But the rest here, it's worth talking about. Hey, comments are down there. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in getting projects on my schedule, or at least arguing with me about it on my Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated to join. Tough times, I understand. But hey, you want the option? There it is. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.